Chris and Katerina on AM 560, The Answer.
Get the latest weather, traffic, and news updates online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. We'll talk a little bit about guns against the backdrop of the Bondi Beach massacre, as well as, of course, the students that were killed and injured at Brown University, as well as that MIT professor that was murdered. And we now know those two acts of violence are connected. I want to talk about guns. The Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese, predictably, he telegraphed it, had this announcement yesterday.
We expect hundreds of thousands of firearms will be collected and destroyed through this scheme. Consistent with the approach that was taken in 1996, the government is proposing that states and territories will be responsible for the collection, processing and payment to individuals for surrendered firearms. The Australian Federal Police will then be responsible for the destruction of these firearms.
Another mandatory buyback program like they did after the Port Arthur massacre in Tasmania 30 years ago, because it worked, except they're doing it again 30 years later. Okay. Of course, they don't have a Second Amendment, and they don't have the Supreme Court jurisprudence that codifies the Second Amendment as an individual right of self-protection that we have. But we have politicians here that have proposed mandatory gun buybacks before. In Illinois, we have the brain trust of the neo-Marxist party in D.C. running around in a knee-jerk fashion, talking about the need for common sense gun control laws, whatever form those might take. You heard from Schumer, you heard from Jayapal, you've heard from a bunch of them this week after the mass shooting at Brown University. So there's some new research from our friend John Lott at the Crime Prevention Research Center. It's sort of interesting. Looking at the issue of civilians with right-to-carry permits interceding to stop crime. Good guy with a gun versus bad guy with a gun. We used ChatGPT and Grok to help put together a list of cases over the last decade where concealed carry permit holders accidentally shot an innocent bystander. Found 4 cases from 2016 through almost all of 2025. And John Lott writes, if people have other cases, please send them our way. Over a decade from 2016 to 2025, including there was a security guard case, which may not really fit the category, but they're going to include it. There are 5 bystanders shot and 2 killed and 3 wounded. Excluding the security guard, 4 people shot, 2 killed, 2 wounded. We did a similar comparison to police over the same years, 2016 to 2025. And there were 20 cases where a total of 28 bystanders were accidentally shot, with 7 killed and 21 wounded. In one case, an officer wounded 6 people. In another case, 3 officers wounded 3 people. So the police accidentally wounded 5.6 times as many bystanders as the civilians during that nearly decade time period, including a security guard wounded in a decade, and 3 times the number killed and 7 times the number wounded. Police accidentally did that at an exponentially higher rate than civilians. They also looked at FBI active shooting cases. Individuals actively attempting to kill people in a populated or confined area, excluding shootings stemming from other crimes, robbery, or gangs. The Crime Prevention Research Center has worked with the Peace Officers Research Association of California and the California Association of Highway Patrolmen on an amicus brief for the Supreme Court. This data, this research, was included in that amicus brief, which details how responsible concealed carry permit holders are. And oh, by the way, just as a point of order, there are 21 million Americans with a right to carry permit, concealed carry permit. From 2014 to 2024, per the Crime Prevention Research's study, using the FBI's active shooter definition, armed civilians stopped 199 of 562 incidents, preventing 35% of the attacks, and rising to 52% in locations where carry was allowed. By contrast, police stopped 167 incidents, which was 30%. Overall, armed civilians have proven remarkably safe and effective. In the 199 civilian interventions, bystanders were accidentally shot only once, with 0 instances of interfering with police. Civilians were killed in just 2 cases and wounded in 49 cases, 24%, and in 58 incidents, 32%. They prevented 58 incidents, 32%. They prevented mass shootings. Uniformed police, despite superior training, faced greater risks and error rates in the 167 incidents they stopped. They shot bystanders accidentally or fellow officers 5 times, more than 5 times the civilian rate. Suffered 19 officers killed, 11%, 11 times the civilian rate, and 51 wounded, 30%. In no active shooter incident did either group have their firearm taken by the attacker. While neither civilians nor police stop every attack, the data demonstrates the presence of armed civilians improves outcomes. You can go to crimeresearch.org to review the data that I was recounting yourself. But after such incidents, when you have politicians saying, and in the case of Australia, doing such things, you have to address this topic again. And so we're doing so. For more on this and other matters related to those violent incidents, James Gagliano joins us, retired FBI supervisory special agent and a doctoral candidate in Homeland Security at St. John's. He also served as mayor of Village of Cornwall-on-Hudson in New York. Jim, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Dan, nice job with the statistics there. Boy, you kind of laid out a roadmap. You make the counter argument pretty damn well with that.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things where, I think most law enforcement respects and even promotes the idea that individuals, who know how to use a gun and can get a concealed carry permit should do that, should be able to protect themselves. Sometimes you get the police chiefs, the executive level, where they have to play politics, who won't go that far. But I assume that's the case at the FBI, too. Generally speaking, you have sensible people that recognize that, it would have been nice at Bondi Beach if that fruit stand owner would have had a gun, and maybe some other people, too, that knew how to use one to stop those shooters before they killed as many as they did.
Well, you laid out the Second Amendment protections we have here, and obviously the Supreme Court and the way they've continually ruled on this. And, Dan, we live in a country of 340 million people, and there are estimates that the amount of firearms in this country are between 340 million and 400 million. Man, the idea and the notion of buyback. I ran a Safe Streets Task Force, a federal Safe Streets Task Force for the FBI back in 2008 to 2013. I was overseeing the most dangerous city in New York, Newburgh, New York, which per capita had more homicides than New York City. And every year, the politicians like Chuck Schumer, our senator at the time, and who's currently still the minority leader in the Senate, would come out and say, we need more gun buyback programs. And the police departments would scramble, and this is what would happen. 2 guys from one house would come in with like a musket that was rusted shut and was like from the 18th century. Yeah. Somebody else would come with a revolver that was missing a cylinder. Somebody else would come in with a pistol where the slide was missing, and they would get a $50 gift card to Hannaford's grocery store. It's a wonderful idea in theory, but the bad guys aren't going to do it. So therein lies the rub. Yeah,
precisely. We've seen the same thing in Chicago. It's absolutely silly, but it's the appearance of doing something versus doing something that's substantively important, which politicians are good at, and they get away with in places like New York and Chicago, unfortunately. The job that the combination of federal and state and local law enforcement did, let's talk about Brown University. This is really not so much about the FBI, except that the FBI was working in concert with local, right? They were the ones that initially detained that young man in suburban Milwaukee that was a person of interest until it was clear that he was not the shooter. But I'm sure you watched the press conferences. What was your impression of the job that, say, the mayor and the police chief and the attorney general and the university president did in managing this case over the last week?
Well, I weighed in on this pretty heavily last night in prime time on television, Dan, and watching each of the press conferences, and I didn't miss a second of any of them, and I listened to every reporter question and every response and every pronouncement from the local officials and the state officials. Dan, I was wholly embarrassed by the messaging. I'm not going to criticize the Providence, Rhode Island Police Department. They've got about 500 members. I thought their chief was in over his head. I thought the attorney general loved an opportunity to get out in front of the cameras.
Yeah, you think?
Much more than he needed to. Yeah. And the fact that the mayor, again, put out some inaccurate information. And look, the FBI isn't above all this. We make mistakes too. And I think one of the reasons you didn't see the FBI out front where they should have been on this was because the Tyler Robinson, Charlie Kirk assassination, prematurely releasing information about having a suspect in custody. And then in this instance, did the same thing with the person of interest. Now, I will quibble with what they put out and what the truth is. That wasn't an investigative detention of the young man at the hotel. That was a custodial interrogation, which is tantamount to an arrest because they held him there until they could run ballistics on the pistols that he had on him and determine that he was not the person. Dan, last night.
Well, yeah, and wait, sorry to interrupt, but that's an important point because they kept going back and forth at the press conference. Remember, the attorney general whispered into the ear of the police chief and said, don't say custodial, say detention, or you said the wrong word, and they kept going back and forth in terms of what that was.
Yeah, so the difference for your listeners, real quick, a little inside baseball. You are allowed to. The Supreme Court ruled in Terry versus Ohio in 1963. You are allowed to make a brief investigative detention of someone if you fear that they have committed a crime, are in the process of committing a crime, or will commit a crime. How do you define brief detention? Well, the difference is the suspect or the subject could be allowed to walk away and say, I'm not staying. In this instance, they went to this quote-unquote person of interest. They didn't have probable cause. They had reasonable suspicion, which is fine. But they held him for a number of hours. That is an arrest. Whether you call it that or not, that is an arrest. And then to lead into the area where a lot of resources were focused there, I get it. In the early stages of an investigation like this, that can happen, and you chase the leads down rabbit holes. But then here's the critical piece that infuriates me. This happened, the Brown shooting, where 2 young students were basically executed in a study hall, and 8 others are fighting for their lives right now. That happened at 4 o'clock on Saturday. 2 days later, on Monday night at 8:30 p.m., about an hour away in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the MIT professor was executed in his home. 2 days there, a little over 48 hours. Why in the hell were there no security cameras on Brown University that were active and rolling? And I'll tell you why. James Gagliano wrote a brilliant op-ed in the Washington Post last week. In 2021, a Brown University doctoral candidate complained about the surveillance state at Brown. He wrote a column for their local campus newspaper, and in the column, he pointed out that there were 800 security cameras on Brown's campus. Brown's campus is a quarter square mile by a quarter square mile. Dan, it's like a city block. It's a postage stamp. And for there to have been no video of this suspect moving in and out and doing what he did, that held the investigation up. And God forbid, if we'd have had that and gotten the lead sooner, maybe the MIT professor wouldn't have had to die too.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And of course, I've heard anywhere between 800 and 1,200 cameras. And you don't get an answer from Christina Paxson, the president. You just basically get it was immaterial. It wouldn't have stopped the shooting, or it wouldn't have changed the outcome. That's what she said. But you're right. It could have changed the outcome for that MIT professor, because you would have had a beat on this guy faster. The other thing is, how is it there was somewhere between 50 and 60 people in that classroom when the shooting started? How is it that you have, say, 45 to 50 people that were able to escape uninjured, and nobody knows if or what the shooter said before he opened fire? And then this other piece yesterday, that the interaction he had with that other individual near the hall where the mass shooting occurred, the police were interested in finding that individual, and they ultimately found him, and were told by a local media there that the individual is a 2010 Brown grad who is some sort of physics genius, but is homeless, and he either lives in that hall where the shooting occurred or near it. And that was the guy who interacted with the shooter when the shooter retreated for a time period, a couple of hours apparently, before he came back and committed the atrocity. And there's just no accounting for any of that.
Yeah, that is bizarre. And again, if I'm going to make criticisms of this, the criticism should be squarely aimed at Brown, because it's a PC, politically correct campus, and people carping about the surveillance state that caused this case not to be solved sooner. That's one piece. The second piece is the second person of interest that the police crowdsourced, and he came forward to the cops and said, "Hey, that's me, and no, I wasn't involved, and this is what I saw." That is what we ask of every citizen in this country. If you see something, say something. This individual did that and was really part of the margin of victory in solving this case and getting this guy so quickly. Look, the guy's a piece of garbage that did this. He's a coward who took his own life rather than face justice here. It's a horrible, horrible story. But again, in all of these incidents, these mass shootings, these terror attacks, there are lessons learned that we often don't put into practice for the next one. The police that didn't go to the sound of the guns at Parkland, not locking doors during the Uvalde shooting in Texas. And what are we going to learn about Brown having inoperable cameras, and a guy was able to get onto campus and leave campus and no one saw him? We picked him up on Ring doorbell video out in the suburbs.
Jim Gagliano, retired FBI supervisory special agent and a doctoral candidate in Homeland Security at St. John's. He also served as mayor of Village of Cornwall-on-Hudson, New York. James, thank you as always for joining us. Merry Christmas. Appreciate it.
Dan, same to you and your family. Merry Christmas, and all the best to your listeners.
Thank you, sir. Jim Gagliano joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line. Coming up at 7:07, we'll turn our attention to hopefully something more beautiful and inspired. We had to deal with so much ugliness this week, as we were just discussing. Chris Arnatti, writer and photographer